In this video, we're going to be working with the 5D Mark IV and its autofocus system. So just like the 1DX and the 7D Mark II, Canon have equipped this camera with some autofocus settings that live under the description AF cases. So what that really means is that there are a group of settings which Canon have decided to put together in one place on the menus, and they have taken those settings and prearranged them in a bunch of different configurations, called them AF cases, and sort of tied them to a sport. So it's really there, it's a bunch of presets that help us to choose which group of settings we should choose, and they're there to help us get to fine-tune the autofocus performance for the kind of moving subjects that we happen to be photographing at the time. The way to get to the AF cases on the 5D Mark IV is to use the menu button and then go to the autofocus menu, which is the pink one, and it's the default or the very first tab on the autofocus menu. And there you can see the camera is currently set on case 2. We can move up using the big dial at the back and move down. If we start with the first one, it's got a picture of a running man. It's called versatile multi-purpose setting. And the second one is for ignoring obstacles. Case 3, it's got a different instantly focus on. I'm even going to stop here, and what I'm going to do is just explain that I don't use any one of these particular cases myself, even though there are 6 of them on offer. And the reason is A, because I don't shoot sports, and B, because I prefer to actually understand what I'm doing when I make a change to the settings, rather than just taking a preset and hoping for the best. So at the end of this video, if you do send me a message and you ask me which case I use, I'm not going to answer that one. If you look at the cases at the beneath the description, there's also 3 control parameters: tracking sensitivity, accelerate or decelerate tracking, and AF point auto switching. So those are really the 3 settings that these cases deal with. So the way I prefer to do it is to ignore the case screen here. I go back to the menu, I use the Q button, and I go to the green My Menu tab on my camera, which allows me to choose my own menu items. So I'm going to say add a menu tab, yes, on the 5D4. Configure that menu, yes. Select the items to register, yes. And then the screen that's popped up now has my entire menu option laid out in a vertical array. So I just scroll down now until I find those 3 settings that deal with autofocus behavior. And there's the first one, tracking sensitivity. Directly below it, accelerate, decelerate tracking, and below that, AF point auto switching. So I'm going to push set, which means I'm registering the first one to my menu. When the camera jumps back into that vertical array, it just does so one option down, which is perfect, because that's the second one, accelerate, decelerate tracking, and then the third one, AF point auto switching. So by pushing OK, by pushing menu now, I can go to my menu, and I now have my own green custom menu with the 3 settings pulled out of the cases. So I don't need to remember I was on case 1 or I was on case 3 last time. I can rather work with these 3 settings as they stand here. of the three parameters that make up the AF cases, I found that tracking sensitivity is by far the most important one for the kind of shooting that I do, and it also has the most impact on how the autofocus actually performs, and I can really feel the difference when I make changes. The other two options are less noticeable to me when I'm changing them. But to get back to tracking sensitivity, if we push set over here, we go in and we find that there's a screen with a slider that has responsive on the far right, and on the far left it has locked on. So what does this really mean? So what we're talking about with tracking sensitivity is really one focus point or an expanded group of focus points, but achieving a lock on a subject. So while we're shooting and we are moving, we've got a moving subject, it's my job to keep that group of focus points on the subject. So I'll be moving my camera hopefully at the same speed that the subject is moving, and I'm trying my best to keep that group of focus points on my subject. But I'm not perfect at doing it, and some of the subjects also move erratically. So should the subject drop away from beneath my focus or above, or if it's a bird and he flies above, or change direction suddenly, what happens is the camera will try to focus on whatever's behind that focus point. So if the subject drops away, my camera is going to focus on the background. And what tracking sensitivity does is it determines how sticky the focus point is at that old distance. So if I set it to responsive, what will happen is the split second that my focus point comes away from the subject, the camera will grab onto the background. Equally, if I'm following a subject and I get something that passes between my subject and the camera, perhaps a bush or a tree or a closer animal, then if I have the camera on responsive, it's likely to instantly grab onto that foreground subject. So responsive is going to give me behavior that's similar to like I've just described. If that isn't helping you, and it may not be, then you may find that the tracking sensitivity is more useful if you either leave it at 0 or you take it towards the locked on side. What that means is that I'm following my subject, keeping my group of focus points close to the subject. Momentarily I drop it off the subject, or some other foreground obstacle comes in front of me and that subject, but the camera won't try to refocus for a short period of time. If I put it on 0, it's a very short period of time. If I set it on -1, it's a longer period of time. And if I set it on -2, it might take up to a second to try to reacquire focus. So that can allow me enough time to find that subject again in the frame, in the viewfinder, and perhaps get the point back on without having grabbed the background. Or it can mean that any obstruction that was in the foreground may have passed away and my subject will be open to me and to the camera and get a lock back on it. So one of the reasons that I don't have a tracking sensitivity setting that I use all the time, and one of the reasons that I keep it in the green My Menu tab where I can get to it quickly and easily, is because I find that with longer focal length I have to slow down and make it a bit more locked on, because I grab the background or I lose the subject more easily. With shorter focal length lenses, perhaps 300 millimeters, perhaps up even to 400 millimeters, I might find that it's easier for me to stay on the subject. I don't make as many mistakes with the shorter focal length, and it's easier for me to get back on the subject quickly if I do drop it. So then I can find that 0 or even +1 maybe is an option, but I keep it handy. I'll start out with 0 as my default somewhere, and then if I find I'm experiencing any of these kind of problems that I've explained here, I'll then make a change one way or the other, and then work on the feedback that I get from that. The second parameter in the AF cases menu is accelerate or decelerate tracking. So we're going to go into that one, and again we find we have a little slider with a little grid that goes to +2 on the right hand side and 0 or -2 on the far left. It doesn't have any descriptive text, although you can push the info button if you want a description of what those settings do. But the way that I best understand it is that the 0 setting is suited for moving subjects that are moving in a relatively constant and stable way. If we take it to -1 or -2, we increase the stability of the focusing system, and we sort of slow down its response to sudden and erratic changes. If we take it to +1 or +2, then we make our focusing system respond quicker to erratic and unpredictable changes in our subject's movement. So for myself, I tend to leave my accelerate, decelerate tracking tab on 0 or sometimes +1. I will admit that it's quite difficult for me to feel the difference in the performance, unlike the tracking sensitivity tab. That one, I make a change, I can feel the difference immediately. With accelerate, decelerate tracking, sometimes a little difficult to know if the camera has changed how it's performing, and also it's a little difficult to know whether I've done exactly the same thing when I followed a subject. When you photograph wildlife, it's a little more difficult to have repeated scenarios where we have animals moving in exactly the same way or exactly the same speed. So that can make it a bit more difficult to interpret exactly what's going on with some of these with some of these sort of low impact settings. But anyway, I keep mine between 0 and +1 for unless I really feel that the focus is becoming too twitchy, where I might take it back. But so far I've not really had that on the 5D Mark IV. The third setting is AF Point Autoswitching. So this one really has to do with those situations where we're using more than one focus point. So AF Expand, with the surround, we've got 9 points with zone, with large zone AF, and with 61 point AF. So what can happen is that you may start tracking with a certain point, even though you've got 61 points enabled, and at some point the camera needs to hand over to an adjacent autofocus point. So because the one that's on is starting to lose contrast or not be aimed in exactly the right place. So this is affected by the parameter here, which is called AF Point Autoswitching. It basically determines how fast one focus point can hand over to the point next to it when the need comes along, and it needs to shift from one point to another point. So if you set it onto +2, that means that one focus point will hand over very quickly to another one if the first selected point, or the first point that caught focus, is losing contrast. 1 is an intermediate setting, and then 0 is a more stable default setting. So again, this is not an option that I found is really easy to feel working in practice, and it's one that I've just left my camera on 0. I've tried a few times with the 5D to set it to extreme and see if I can feel any difference, but I've not really picked up a big difference. But those 3 parameters are basically having an impact on how your servo focusing will work, how twitchy it is, particularly with tracking sensitivity being the big driver of that. So you can make it very responsive, meaning it will grab a new subject quickly if you move the focus point off or you become obstructed, or you can make it more stable, slow it down a little, something that I tend to do when I'm using longer focal lengths. But keeping it in a screen, in my menu screen, means that your settings here are quick and easy to get to, and they also override whatever's been selected in the AF cases. So I found that to be an easier way for me to work as a wildlife photographer with the 5D Mark IV's autofocus. That's about it for now on 5D Mark IV's autofocusing. The camera definitely has the best autofocus system that Canon have put into a 5D series. So just get out there and get some good photos with your one. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep getting videos about Canon gear from a wildlife photographer's perspective.